Welcome back to English Naturally, where you learn English through real, understandable content. If you understand around 70% of what I'm saying, that's perfect. And if you need help, subtitles are there to help you. So today I want to start what might become a new series on this channel. And the idea is very simple. Looking at stereotypes about Americans and asking if they're actually true. And today's stereotype is probably one of the biggest and most, especially from a European perspective. Do Americans really love guns? Yes, of course we do. Then again, on second thought, no. Many Americans hate guns. So which is it? Do Americans love or hate guns? Is this stereotype true or not? Well, let me try to explain, and be sure to stick around to the end where I tell my own terrifying story of being shot at by a long-range rifle. Now, for many Europeans, especially in countries like Germany, this part of American culture can seem almost impossible to understand. You hear about school shootings, mass shootings, people carrying guns in public, and maybe you think, why is this normal in America? Or maybe you asked yourself after the school shooting at Sandy Hook Elementary School, yes, I said elementary school, where 20 children were killed as part of this absolute tragedy. Maybe you asked yourself, surely now the Americans will implement stricter gun measures. Well, as you know, there have been several school shootings since this tragedy at Sandy Hook Elementary, and no major new gun legislation or laws have been passed. So the stereotype must be true. Americans love their guns and prioritize their right to own them even over the safety of their own children. Well, I might have exaggerated there. And the answer is complicated because the stereotype is both true and misleading at the same time. There definitely are Americans who absolutely love guns, but there are also millions of Americans who hate gun culture, support stricter gun laws, or have never even touched a gun in their entire life. So today I want to explain a little bit of the history behind this, why the debate is so emotional, and why Americans often think about guns very differently from Europeans. So first of all, yes, guns are much more common in the United States than in most European countries. In some parts of America, especially rural areas, owning a gun is completely normal. People grow up around guns. Their parents had guns, their grandparents had guns, and maybe they learned how to shoot when they were children. Even I shot them growing up, and I don't exactly belong to the demographic of gun owners. What are demographics exactly? Demographics is basically statistical information about groups of people. Age, income, education level, gender, race, things like that. So the demographics of gun owners are pretty interesting. First of all, about 30% of all Americans personally own a gun. And a higher number, about 45%, live in a house with a gun. So maybe you're thinking, 45% of all Americans live in a house with a gun? That's a lot. And you're not wrong, but it's still worth noting that 45% means that the majority of Americans do not live in a house with a gun. Other important demographics regarding gun ownership: rural Americans, that is, people that live in the countryside or far away from the big city. About every second rural American owns a gun. That's about 50%. Compare that to the people who live in urban areas or big cities. There, only 20% own guns. Finally, you have suburban Americans, or people who live in these typical neighborhoods you see in a lot of Hollywood films. You know, the houses with the white picket fences, and the big yards, and the wide streets. These are the suburbs, the areas just outside a big city where people can commute to work in the big city, but enjoy a quieter, calmer life in the suburbs. Well, about 30% of suburban Americans own guns. In terms of sheer number of gun owners, it seems pretty clear to say that not all Americans love guns. So maybe we should instead ask ourselves, why do the people that do love guns love them so much? I mean, I have my own personal anecdote. I grew up in Utah, in the suburbs, but the state is rather close to nature, and right behind our house we had the mountains. And like a lot of people do in Utah, sometimes we drove up the mountains and drank some beer, and we hung around and we laughed, right? And one time I drove up with some people who owned guns. Well, after some beers, they asked me if I wanted to try the gun. Now, obviously this isn't according to the regulations, and I was a bit younger at the time, but of course I fired the shotgun. They actually had clay pigeons with them, and I still remember the feeling when I pulled the trigger, felt the pressure against my shoulder, and watched as the pigeon exploded practically instantaneously afterwards. And in that moment, I understood. This is why people love guns. Okay, I'm being a little bit tongue-in-cheek or funny. Obviously, this feeling alone does not entirely explain why some Americans love their guns so much. A lot of it actually has to do with identity. And indeed, it is exploring this idea of identity that we can see why some people link gun ownership with being a true American. You have to understand a bit of American history and a little something called the Second Amendment. Quick little detail about the American Constitution, which is the sacred document that more or less defines our government and how it works. That is, how the power is divided among 3 different branches and how much power each branch has. The Constitution also gives certain rights and freedoms to its citizens, and a lot of these freedoms come in the first 10 amendments, or additions, to the Constitution. In fact, these first 10 amendments are also called the Bill of Rights. Well, the second of these 10 amendments, the Second Amendment, is the one that protects citizens' right to own guns. At least that's how we would say it in modern language. And this reinterpretation of the original language in the Constitution is where some of the modern debate comes from. Let me quickly explain. The Second Amendment literally says, "A well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed." Okay, so this is written in the 1700s, and even the grammar is different. Let's just focus on this one phrase, a well-regulated militia, because this is the heart of the debate. You have to remember that the United States was born through revolution. America literally fought a war against the British Empire in order to become independent. And after that revolution, many Americans deeply distrusted centralized government power. They were afraid of tyranny. They were afraid that a strong government could eventually become oppressive. But this word militia is important. The definition of a militia is a military force made up of ordinary citizens rather than professional soldiers. So one of the questions that comes up is if the Second Amendment really intends individuals to own guns, right? Because a militia is not an individual. Some people argue it applies to a now outdated situation in the 1700s, and that obviously militias are not going to protect us from the tyranny of the government. Because if the US government today, if the US military really wants to come in, say, to a rural town in Utah, and if the US government brings in their tanks, aircrafts, missiles, all the automatic rifles in the world are not going to help this militia defend the town. However, this idea also illustrates another aspect of gun ownership in America, and the idea of individualism and living on the land, away from all intrusion or influence of the government. In early American history, guns were also practical tools. People hunted with them. They protected farms and property with them. And in many frontier areas, there wasn't always strong government protection or police infrastructure. So historically, guns became deeply connected to the American identity. Now, of course, critics of this argument say, okay, but society has completely changed since the 1700s. And that's where the modern debate begins. Because one side argues that gun ownership is a constitutional right connected to freedom and self-protection. And the other side argues that modern gun violence, especially mass shootings and school shootings, clearly show that stricter gun laws are necessary for public safety. Remember, over 20 children, 6 and 7 years old, were victims to a school shooting that stricter gun laws might have prevented. And this is just one school shooting. Depending on the broadest definition of what a school shooting is, there are roughly 300 to 350 reported school shootings every year in America. That's practically one a day. But to be fair, this type of school shooting like Sandy Hook Elementary or Columbine or the other big ones in the news are much less common. Though many would still argue the 1 to 5 of these that do happen every year are still too much. So the debate about guns continues. And this debate becomes incredibly emotional because both sides often feel like the other side fundamentally misunderstands them. For many conservatives, stricter gun laws are not just about guns. They see it as part of a larger question about government control, individual freedom, and constitutional rights. Meanwhile, many liberals look at repeated mass shootings and think, how can this continue happening? Why can't America simply pass stricter gun laws like many European countries? And because both sides feel morally right, compromise becomes very difficult. Another important factor is political lobbying. These are organizations like the National Rifle Association, often called the NRA, and they have historically had an enormous political influence in the United States. I'm sure you've heard about this before. There's many documentaries also in European languages about this. But these organizations defend gun rights very aggressively and support politicians who oppose stricter gun regulations. Their influence cannot be underestimated. And over time, guns became connected not just to personal identity, but also political identity. In other words, for some Americans, owning a gun is not only about the gun itself. It becomes symbolic. It represents independence, freedom, tradition, self-reliance, or distrust of government power. Now, personally, one thing I find interesting after living in Germany for so many years is how differently Europeans and Americans often think about the relationship between the individual and the state. In many European countries, there tends to be more trust in government institutions and more acceptance that the government should regulate certain things for collective safety. Whereas in America, there's often a much stronger cultural instinct toward individual liberty and skepticism toward government authority. And again, this doesn't mean one side is automatically correct and the other side is automatically wrong, but it does help explain why this debate feels so different in America compared to Europe. So, do Americans really love guns? Some definitely do. But for many Americans, the issue is not simply about loving guns. It's connected to history, identity, freedom, fear, political values, tradition, and very different ideas about what creates a safe society. Oh, and what about my own story of being shot at? Well, I'll try and keep it short. I was back in Utah, hiking up the mountain that I used to hike as a kid, comparing it to the treks I had done in the Alps. It was as hard as I remembered it, by the way. But after 3 hours of hard hiking, I was close to the peak. In fact, the hardest part was already behind me, and I could see the peak about 20 minutes of a gradual hike ahead. Nothing was going to stop me from getting there now. I all but skipped along the ridgeline when I heard it, the first shot. I didn't think much of it at all, as it was far away and as it was rural Utah. People shoot guns all the time, as you know. after drinking some beer with friends. I kept going, of course, and I didn't think much of the next distant shots either. It was only after the fourth shot that I stopped. Then, as I crouched down a bit with a weird feeling, I heard it. A whoosh over my head. It was a bullet. I couldn't believe it. I was being shot at. I looked toward the peak one last time. I was only 20 minutes away. But I turned around and started running. Obviously, I survived, and I know for a fact that I was being shot at from afar. The only question that remains is if this shooter was really trying to kill me, or if it was just a messed up idea of fun to just try and scare some solitary hiker on a beautiful summer day. Be sure to like and subscribe if you like this. It really helps. Leave me a comment if you want to see more of this type of content.